My former lab partner stood at the podium of the International Medical Research Conference and told 600 doctors that I had stolen his life's work. He said this while a PowerPoint presentation behind him displayed what he claimed was evidence. Lab notebooks, research notes, patent applications, all suggesting that the breakthrough medical treatment that saved thousands of lives and earned me international recognition was actually his discovery, not mine. Dr. David Chen spoke with the wounded dignity of a man who'd been wronged for decades. He told the audience that Dr. Helen Crawford was celebrated as a pioneer in cancer research, that my treatment protocol for aggressive breast cancer had improved 5-year survival rates by 40%, that I'd won awards and grants and recognition from every major medical institution in the world, but that none of it was actually mine, that I'd stolen his research in 1996 and built my entire career on his stolen work. I sat in the third row, watching this man I'd worked alongside for 3 years systematically destroy my reputation in front of colleagues from around the world. Some of them were looking at me with shock. Some were whispering to each other. None of them knew what to believe. David explained to the audience that we'd worked together at Philadelphia Research Institute in the mid-90s, that we'd been co-investigators on a project studying targeted drug delivery for cancer treatment, that he'd developed the core methodology, that the breakthrough had been his insight, his innovation, his discovery, but that I'd pushed him out of the project, published the research under my name, and taken all the credit. He showed slides of old lab notebooks, pages that looked like early versions of the research that eventually became my published work, pages with his handwriting, pages dated before my published papers. My hands were trembling in my lap, not from age, not from fear, from absolute rage that this man could stand there and lie so completely, so convincingly, so publicly. Tomorrow is the dedication ceremony for the Crawford Cancer Research Center, a new facility funded by grants I'd secured over my career, named in my honor. 200 people will be there. Colleagues, former patients whose lives were saved by my treatment protocol, medical students I've mentored, donors who believed in my work. What they don't know is that I've invited someone special to that ceremony, someone David Chen doesn't know still exists, someone who's going to prove that every word he just said was a lie. But to understand how we got here, to understand how a failed researcher could spend 28 years nursing a grudge and planning this moment of revenge, I need to take you back to when we were both young scientists who thought we could change the world. My name is Dr. Helen Crawford. I'm 68 years old, and this is the story of how ambition without ethics creates monsters, and how the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined lies. I was born in 1956 in Boston, Massachusetts. My mother was a nurse. My father was a high school chemistry teacher. Science wasn't just something we did in my family. It was how we understood the world. My earliest memories are of my father's home laboratory in our basement. Nothing fancy or dangerous. Just a workbench with beakers and microscopes, and the kinds of simple experiments that could show a curious child how the world worked at a molecular level. He'd let me help him prepare demonstrations for his classes, mixing safe chemicals that changed colors, growing crystals, looking at pond water under the microscope. He taught me to see science as a way of asking questions and finding answers. Taught me that the universe followed rules we could discover if we were patient and careful and honest. That word, honest, was important to him. He'd always say that a scientist who lied about their data wasn't really a scientist at all, just someone playing dress-up with laboratory equipment. I knew I wanted to be a scientist from the time I was 10 years old, not just any scientist, a medical researcher, someone who could take the fundamental discoveries about how the body worked and turn them into treatments that saved lives. I'd seen my grandmother die of cancer when I was 9, watched her waste away over 6 months, watched the treatments make her sicker, watched her suffer. I wanted to find better ways to fight that disease. I went to MIT for undergrad, studied molecular biology, got my PhD at Harvard Medical School in 1983, did my postdoctoral work at Massachusetts General Hospital in cancer research. Every step of my education reinforced what my father had taught me. That science required absolute honesty, that your reputation in the research community was built on the reliability of your work, that cutting corners or falsifying data or stealing credit was the fastest way to destroy a career. I got my first real position in 1988 at Philadelphia Research Institute, a private research facility funded by pharmaceutical companies and government grants. Not the most prestigious place, but it had excellent facilities and freedom to pursue interesting questions. I was hired as a junior researcher working on drug delivery systems for cancer treatment. The challenge back then was that many cancer drugs were incredibly toxic. They killed cancer cells, yes, but they also damaged healthy tissue. Patients would get violently ill from chemotherapy. Some would die from the treatment instead of the disease. The drugs worked, but we needed better ways to deliver them specifically to tumors while sparing healthy tissue. I spent 6 years working on that problem, trying different approaches, testing various delivery mechanisms in cell cultures and animal models, making slow, incremental progress. That's how real science works. Not dramatic breakthroughs, just patient, careful work that builds understanding one small piece at a time. In 1994, the Institute hired a new researcher, Dr. David Chen. He'd just finished his postdoc at Johns Hopkins. Brilliant on paper, published several papers as a graduate student, strong recommendations from his advisors. He was brought in to work on the same drug delivery project I'd been leading. Initially, I was glad to have the help. Research is collaborative. Multiple perspectives make the work stronger. David seemed enthusiastic and hard-working those first few months. He'd stay late in the lab, come in on weekends, always asking questions about my previous work and my current approaches. But I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. Small things at first. David would describe experiments he claimed to have run, but there'd be no data in his lab notebook. He'd present results at our weekly meetings that seemed too good to be true. When I'd ask to see the raw data, he'd say he needed to organize it better first. Then he'd present slightly different numbers the next week. I mentioned my concerns to our director, Dr. Robert Martinez, told him I was worried David might not be following proper protocols, that his data seemed inconsistent, that I couldn't reproduce his results when I tried his methods. Dr. Martinez took it seriously. He started watching David's work more carefully, started asking harder questions in our meetings. David's results started becoming less impressive, more realistic, but also less frequent. He seemed to be running fewer experiments overall. Then, in early 1995, I had a breakthrough. A real one. Not the kind David had been claiming. The kind that comes from 6 years of systematic work finally paying off. I'd been experimenting with lipid nanoparticles as drug carriers. The idea was that you could package chemotherapy drugs inside tiny spheres of lipid molecules. Then you could coat those spheres with proteins that would bind specifically to cancer cells. The particles would circulate through the bloodstream, ignore healthy tissue, and deliver their toxic payload directly to tumors. It wasn't an entirely new concept. Other researchers had tried similar approaches, but I'd figured out a specific combination of lipid composition and surface proteins that showed remarkable specificity in my cell culture studies. The nanoparticles were finding and binding to breast cancer cells while ignoring normal breast tissue cells at a ratio of about 90:1. That's extraordinary selectivity. That's the difference between a treatment that makes patients sick and a treatment that actually cures them. I was ecstatic. Started running more experiments to verify the results. Started testing different cancer cell lines to see if the approach was specific to breast cancer or more general. Started preparing to test the delivery system in mouse models. I shared my preliminary results with the team at our weekly meeting, showed everyone the data, explained the methodology, discussed next steps. Standard, scientific collaboration. David was very interested, asked detailed questions about the exact lipid composition, about the protein coating process, about how I was measuring the binding specificity. I answered everything openly. That's how science works. We share methods so others can verify and build on our work. 2 weeks later, Dr. Martinez called me into his office. He looked deeply uncomfortable, told me he needed to discuss something serious. He said David had filed a complaint, claimed that I was taking credit for his work, that the nanoparticle delivery system was actually his idea, something he'd been developing before I'd shown any results, that I'd stolen his research and was trying to publish it as my own. I was stunned. Told Dr. Martinez that was completely false, that I had months of documented work leading up to the breakthrough, that David had never mentioned working on anything similar, that this was my project, my insight, my discovery. Dr. Martinez said he believed me, but that he had to investigate the complaint formally, that he needed to review both of our lab notebooks, that he needed to interview other lab members, that until the investigation was complete, neither of us could publish anything related to the nanoparticle delivery system. The investigation took 6 weeks. 6 weeks where I couldn't move forward with my research, couldn't publish my findings, couldn't start the animal trials I'd been planning. Just had to wait while Dr. Martinez examined every piece of evidence. What he found was damning. For David, not for me. Dr. Martinez called me back into his office, told me he'd reviewed everything carefully. My lab notebook showed a clear progression of work over 6 years. Dated entries, consistent methodology, raw data that matched my reported results. An obvious path from my early experiments to the breakthrough result. David's notebooks told a different story. There were entries that looked like early work on nanoparticle delivery. Yes, but the dates were wrong. The entries had been backdated. Dr. Martinez had compared the ink and paper to other entries in David's notebook using forensic techniques. The supposedly early work on nanoparticles had actually been written after I'd presented my results at our team meeting. David had faked his lab notebook entries, had tried to create a false paper trail showing he'd been working on the same approach before me. It was fraud, scientific misconduct of the most serious kind. But there was more. Dr. Martinez had also discovered irregularities in David's earlier data, results that couldn't be reproduced, experiments that probably had never been run, numbers that were too perfect, showing none of the natural variation you always see in real biological data. Dr. Martinez had concluded that David Chen had been falsifying research data for at least a year, probably longer. He was terminating David's employment immediately, reporting him to the Office of Research Integrity, recommending that his PhD institution review his dissertation for possible misconduct. David was fired that same day, escorted from the building by security, banned from the campus. His career in research was essentially over. Once you're caught falsifying data, no legitimate institution will hire you. No journal will publish your work. You're done. I felt terrible about it. Even though David had tried to steal my work and destroy my reputation, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad that someone with his intelligence had thrown away his career through dishonesty. Sad that the pressure to publish and achieve had pushed him to fraud instead of honest work. But I moved on, continued my research, published my findings in a major journal in 1996, Started the animal trials that showed the nanoparticle delivery system worked in living organisms, not just cell cultures. Started working toward human clinical trials. The work took years. That's normal in medical research. You can't rush from a promising result in a petri dish to treating human patients. You have to test safety, test dosing, test for side effects, test in multiple animal models, get approval from regulatory agencies, design proper clinical trials with controls and statistical rigor. But by 2001, we started human trials. Small trials at first, just testing whether the treatment was safe in humans, whether patients could tolerate it, whether the nanoparticles behaved in human bodies the way they did in mice. The results were encouraging. The treatment was safe. Patients tolerated it well. And most importantly, it worked. Women with aggressive breast cancer, who would normally have had maybe a 30% 5-year survival rate, were surviving at 70%. The treatment was targeting tumors specifically, delivering chemotherapy directly to cancer cells while sparing most healthy tissue. Patients weren't getting nearly as sick from the treatment. By 2005, the treatment was approved by the FDA. By 2008, it was standard care for certain types of breast cancer. By 2012, I'd won major awards from cancer research organizations. By 2015, pharmaceutical companies had licensed my patents and were making versions of the treatment for other cancers. I'd achieved what I'd set out to do at age 10. I'd found a better way to fight cancer. I'd saved lives. Thousands of women were alive because of research I'd done patiently and carefully over 2 decades. I never heard from David Chen after he was fired in 1995. Never saw his name in any scientific journals. Never ran into him at conferences. I assumed he'd left research entirely. Maybe gone into business or teaching or something else where his misconduct wouldn't follow him. I was wrong. About 8 months ago, I started getting emails from colleagues. Had I seen the new blog? Had I read what David Chen was writing? Was I aware of the accusations he was making? I looked up the blog. It was called Scientific Misconduct Exposed, and it was written by David Chen. The entire blog was about me. Post after post claiming I'd stolen his research, that I'd built my career on his stolen work, that the cancer treatment everyone credited to me was actually his discovery. He'd posted photos of his old lab notebooks. The ones with the backdated entries that Dr. Martinez had proven were fraudulent. But David was presenting them as proof that he'd been working on nanoparticle delivery before I published my results. He didn't mention that the entries had been proven to be faked. He claimed that Dr. Martinez had been pressured to fire him to protect me and the Institute's reputation, that there had been no real investigation, that I'd had connections and influence he didn't have, that the whole thing had been a cover-up. The blog posts were getting attention, not from serious scientists who knew how research integrity investigations worked, but from people who loved conspiracy theories, people who wanted to believe that scientific institutions were corrupt, people who distrusted experts and credentials. David's blog started getting shared on social media. People who'd never done scientific research in their lives were commenting about how big research protected their own, how someone like David never had a chance against an established researcher like me, how this proved you couldn't trust scientists. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that anyone who understood science would see through his lies, that the truth was documented and available, that my reputation was built on decades of verified work that hundreds of other researchers had built upon and confirmed. But the accusations kept spreading. David started giving interviews to alternative media outlets, podcasts that promoted conspiracy theories, blogs that existed to tear down mainstream institutions. He was building a following among people who wanted to believe that experts were frauds. Then, 3 months ago, David published a book, Stolen Brilliance: How Dr. Helen Crawford Built Her Career on My Research. self-published. No reputable publisher would touch it because they'd actually check facts. But self-publishing meant David could say whatever he wanted without anyone verifying his claims. The book told a completely fictional version of our time working together. In David's version, he was the brilliant young researcher with innovative ideas. I was the mediocre established scientist who'd been struggling for years without results. When David developed the breakthrough nanoparticle delivery system, I'd recognized its importance and stolen it, used my influence to get him fired when he protested, then published his work under my name. None of it was true, but it was a compelling narrative. Underdog genius versus corrupt establishment. People wanted to believe it. The book started selling. Not huge numbers, maybe a few thousand copies, but enough that David started getting invited to speak at events, anti-establishment conferences, alternative medicine conventions, places where people were predisposed to distrust mainstream medical research. And then, somehow, David got invited to speak at the International Medical Research Conference, a legitimate scientific conference, with thousands of attendees from around the world, with sessions on cutting-edge research and presentations from leading scientists. I have no idea how he managed it, whether someone on the organizing committee believed his story, whether he misrepresented his credentials, whether it was just a mistake by someone who didn't check his background carefully enough. But there he was, scheduled to give a presentation titled Research Integrity and the Silencing of Inconvenient Discoveries. Scheduled in the ethics track, a series of presentations about scientific misconduct and how institutions handle allegations. I was also presenting at the conference, a keynote talk about the development of targeted drug delivery systems and their impact on cancer treatment. Basically, a presentation about my life's work. When I saw David was on the program, I contacted the conference organizers immediately. Explained our history. Explained that David had been fired for research misconduct. Explained that his allegations against me had been investigated and found to be completely false. The organizers said they were aware of the controversy, that they believed in giving all perspectives a fair hearing, that David's presentation was about research integrity processes, not making accusations, that I could present my side if I wanted. I should have realized then what he was planning. But I thought he'd just give some abstract talk about how misconduct investigations could be biased. I didn't think he'd use the platform to directly attack me in front of 600 scientists. I was wrong. Yesterday was the conference. David's presentation was scheduled in the morning. Mine was in the afternoon. I almost didn't attend his talk, but my colleague, Dr. Sarah Kim, convinced me I should be there, should hear what he was saying, should be prepared to respond if needed. So I sat in that auditorium and watched David Chen give the most dishonest presentation I've ever seen at a scientific conference. He started by introducing himself as a researcher who'd been silenced for discovering something inconvenient, who'd been pushed out of his field for threatening the career of a more powerful scientist, who'd spent 28 years watching someone else get credit for his work while he was blacklisted and prevented from publishing. Then he put up the slides of his lab notebooks, made them look like careful, detailed research that predated my published work. Didn't mention that forensic analysis had proven those entries were backdated. Didn't mention that he'd been caught falsifying data. He showed a timeline that made it look like I'd published my breakthrough right after he'd been fired. Implied I'd been waiting for him to be removed so I could steal his work without him being around to object. Didn't mention that I'd been working on the project for 6 years before he was even hired. He claimed the investigation into his misconduct had been a sham, that Dr. Martinez had been pressured by the Institute to protect their star researcher, that I'd had powerful connections that prevented a fair investigation, that he'd never been given a chance to defend himself. All lies, all easily disproven lies, but presented in a way that sounded plausible to people who didn't know the real story. The worst part was watching some people in the audience nodding along, especially younger researchers who didn't know me personally, who'd only read about my work in journals, who might be inclined to believe that established scientists could get away with misconduct because of their influence. After David's presentation, there was a Q&A session. Someone asked if Dr. Crawford was aware of these allegations. David said, of course I was aware, that I'd been denying them for 28 years, that I'd used my position to prevent him from getting a fair hearing. Someone else asked why he hadn't pursued legal action if his work was really stolen. David said he'd tried, that I'd hidden behind institutional protections, that the system was designed to protect researchers like me and silence researchers like him. Another person asked if anyone had verified his lab notebooks. David said they were available for examination, that forensic analysis had never been properly done, that Dr. Martinez had made a predetermined conclusion to protect the institute. More lies, but lies that people were believing. The session ended. People started coming up to David, expressing sympathy, telling him they admired his courage in speaking out, treating him like a brave whistleblower instead of what he actually was. A fraud who'd been caught and was now trying to rehabilitate his reputation by destroying mine. I sat there feeling sick, feeling like my entire career was being undone by lies, feeling helpless because I couldn't stand up and shout the truth without looking defensive, without playing into David's narrative that I was trying to silence him. Dr. Sarah Kim came over to me, told me not to worry, that my presentation that afternoon would set the record straight, that people who mattered would recognize David's claims for what they were. But I wasn't sure anymore. David had been very convincing. His lies had been carefully constructed, and he'd tapped into something real. People's distrust of powerful institutions, people's sympathy for underdogs, people's desire to believe they were seeing through official narratives to hidden truth. I went back to my hotel room, tried to prepare for my keynote, but all I could think about was David's presentation, about how many people believed him, about how my legacy was being destroyed. That's when I got a phone call that changed everything, from Dr. Robert Martinez, the director who'd investigated David's misconduct 28 years ago, who'd fired him, who'd reported him for fraud. Dr. Martinez was 82 years old now, retired for over a decade, living in Florida, but he'd heard about David's book, about his accusations, about his conference presentation that morning. He was furious, told me that David's claims were outrageous lies, that the investigation had been thorough and conclusive, that he still had all the documentation, the forensic analysis of the backdated notebook entries, the evidence of data falsification, the independent reviews that had confirmed David's misconduct. He said he'd kept everything in his files, that he'd known someday David might try to rewrite history, that he was willing to come to the conference and present the real evidence if I wanted him there. I told him my keynote was that afternoon. He said he could get there, could catch a flight that morning and arrive by early afternoon, could attend my presentation and be ready to respond if needed. I also made another call to my former research assistant from the 90s, Dr. Jennifer Wu. She'd been working in the lab during all of this, had witnessed David's misconduct, had been interviewed during the investigation, had seen him escorted out of the building after he was fired. Jennifer was a professor now at Stanford, successful researcher in her own right. She'd been furious when she'd heard about David's accusations, had wanted to speak out but didn't know how. I asked if she could come to my keynote. She said she was already planning to, that she'd flown in that morning specifically to support me, that she had her own documentation from that time, her own lab notebooks showing her work in the lab alongside mine. showing that I'd been leading the nanoparticle project long before David was even hired. Then I made one more call. To a patient, a woman named Barbara who'd been in my first clinical trial in 2001, who'd had aggressive stage 3 breast cancer with a poor prognosis, who'd been treated with my nanoparticle delivery system as part of the trial. Barbara was alive 23 years later, cancer-free. She'd become a friend over the years, had told me many times that I'd saved her life, that her children had their mother because of my research, that her grandchildren, who hadn't even been born when she was diagnosed, got to know their grandmother because I'd developed a better treatment. I asked Barbara if she'd be willing to come to my presentation, to tell her story. She said she'd be honored, that she'd tell everyone exactly what my research had meant to her and her family. My keynote was scheduled for 2 p.m. I arrived at the auditorium at 1:30. The room was already filling up. 600 seats. Most of them would be full. People had come from around the world to hear me talk about targeted drug delivery and cancer treatment. But now they were also coming because of David's presentation that morning. Some were curious whether I'd address his allegations. Some were there to see if I'd defend myself. Some probably believed David and wanted to see how I'd respond. Dr. Martinez arrived at 1:45. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp and his handshake was firm. He had a briefcase full of documents, the original investigation files, everything we'd need to prove the truth. Jennifer Wu was already there, sitting in the front row with her own folder of materials, ready to provide testimony if needed. Barbara arrived at 1:50, nervous but determined. She'd brought her daughter and her grandson with her, 3 generations of her family alive because of research David was claiming I'd stolen. The presentation started at 2 p.m. exactly. I walked up to the podium, looked out at 600 faces, some friendly, some neutral, some skeptical, probably wondering if everything they'd heard that morning was true. I didn't start with my planned presentation about drug delivery systems. Instead, I started with the truth. I told them my name was Dr. Helen Crawford, that I'd spent 40 years in cancer research, that this morning, many of them had heard serious allegations about my integrity, about whether my work was really mine, about whether I'd built my career on stolen research. I said I could give them the presentation they'd come to hear about targeted drug delivery systems, or I could address those allegations directly with evidence and witnesses. Let them see the real documentation and hear from people who were actually there, actually knew what had happened. I asked them what they wanted to hear, the planned presentation or the truth about David Chen's allegations. The room was completely silent for a moment. Then someone in the back called out that they wanted to hear the truth. Others agreed. Within seconds, the entire room was saying they wanted to hear my response to David's claims. I nodded, told them I'd present the evidence, let them judge for themselves who was telling the truth. First, I showed them my lab notebooks from 1988 to 1996. 8 years of documented research, dated entries, consistent progression of work, raw data that matched my published results, a clear path from early experiments to the breakthrough discovery. I explained that every page was dated, that lab notebooks were legal documents in research, that they were never supposed to be altered or backdated, that the dates showed I'd been working systematically on the nanoparticle delivery problem for 6 years before David Chen was even hired at the Institute. Then I showed them David's lab notebooks, the pages he'd presented that morning as proof he'd been working on the same approach first. I explained that forensic analysis in 1995 had proven these entries were backdated, that the ink and paper didn't match other entries from the dates he'd claimed, that he'd faked this evidence after stealing my ideas following a team meeting where I'd presented my preliminary results. I could see confusion in the audience. People who'd believed David that morning suddenly weren't so sure. The forensic evidence was pretty hard to argue with. Then I invited Dr. Robert Martinez to come up to the stage. He walked up slowly, but with dignity, introduced himself as the director who'd investigated David's misconduct allegations in 1995, who'd reviewed all the evidence, who'd made the decision to terminate David's employment. Dr. Martinez explained in detail what the investigation had found, that David had been falsifying research data for at least a year, that he'd backdated lab notebook entries to make it appear he'd been working on ideas before he actually had, that when confronted with this evidence, he'd had no credible explanation, that the decision to fire him had been based on clear, documented scientific fraud. He showed the original forensic reports, the analysis of the ink and paper, the interviews with other lab members, the independent reviews by scientists from other institutions who'd confirmed the misconduct. All of it documented, all of it preserved for 28 years. Dr. Martinez said that David's claims of a biased investigation were completely false, that the process had been thorough and fair, that David had been given every opportunity to explain the inconsistencies in his work, that he'd failed to provide any legitimate explanation. Then Dr. Jennifer Wu came up to the stage. She introduced herself as a research assistant who'd worked in the lab during the time in question, who'd witnessed the entire situation firsthand, who'd seen David's behavior, and had been interviewed during the investigation. Jennifer explained that she'd worked closely with me for 4 years before David was hired, that she'd seen my research progress on nanoparticle delivery, that she'd helped run some of the experiments, that she had her own lab notebooks documenting work she'd done under my supervision long before David arrived. She said David had joined the lab in 1994 and had seemed promising at first, but that she and others had noticed inconsistencies in his reported results. That data didn't seem reproducible, that he'd become defensive when asked questions about his methodology. She said that after I presented my breakthrough results at a team meeting, David had immediately become interested in my specific approach, had asked detailed questions, had wanted to see all my protocols and materials. 2 weeks later, he'd filed a complaint claiming the work was his. Jennifer said it had been obvious to everyone in the lab what had happened, that David had tried to steal credit for my work when he realized it was going to be important, that when his attempt failed and he was caught fabricating evidence, he'd been fired, and now, 28 years later, he was trying to rewrite history. The audience was listening intently now. These weren't abstract accusations anymore. This was specific testimony from someone who'd been there, who'd seen it happen. Then I invited Barbara to come up to the stage. She walked up nervously, stood at the podium and introduced herself as a breast cancer survivor. Said she'd been diagnosed in 2000 with stage 3 triple-negative breast cancer, that her oncologist had told her she had maybe a 35% chance of surviving 5 years. Barbara explained that she'd been enrolled in my clinical trial in 2001, that she'd been treated with the nanoparticle drug delivery system, that the treatment had targeted her tumor specifically, that she'd experienced far fewer side effects than she would have with conventional chemotherapy. She said that here she was, 23 years later, cancer-free, alive, that she'd watched her children graduate from college, that she'd attended their weddings, that she'd held her grandchildren, that none of that would have happened without my research. Barbara's voice started shaking. She said she didn't understand all the science, didn't know about lab notebooks or investigations, but she knew that Dr. Crawford had saved her life, that the treatment worked, that thousands of women were alive because of research I'd done patiently and carefully over decades. She said David Chen could make whatever accusations he wanted, but he couldn't change the fact that real patients had been saved by real science, that my treatment worked and was being used successfully around the world, that no amount of lies could change that reality. The room was silent when Barbara finished. Some people were crying. The human impact of the research had just become very real to everyone there. I stepped back up to the podium, told the audience I had one more piece of evidence to show them. I projected emails onto the screen behind me. Emails from 2015, 10 years ago, from David Chen to me. Emails I'd never responded to. In these emails, David admitted everything. Said he'd made terrible mistakes early in his career, that he'd panicked when his data wasn't working out, that he'd started falsifying results because he was afraid of failing, that when I'd made my breakthrough discovery, he'd seen a chance to save his career by claiming it was his, that when that failed, he'd been too ashamed and angry to admit what he'd done. He wrote that he'd spent 20 years working in pharmaceutical sales, not research, that he'd never been able to get another research position because of his misconduct record, that he was sorry for what he'd tried to do to me, that he hoped someday I could forgive him. The emails were dated, authenticated. David had sent them from his personal email account. They were archived and verifiable. I explained that 10 years ago, David had reached out trying to make amends, trying to take some responsibility for what he'd done. I hadn't responded because I didn't know what to say, didn't know if his apology was genuine. But now, apparently, David had decided to go in a completely different direction, to deny everything, to claim he'd been wronged, to build a new narrative where he was the victim and I was the villain. I asked the audience to consider all the evidence they'd seen. My documented research spanning years, forensic proof that David's evidence was faked, testimony from the director who'd investigated, testimony from someone who'd worked in the lab, testimony from a patient whose life was saved, and David's own words from 10 years ago admitting what he'd done. Then I asked them to consider what David had presented. Old lab notebook pages proven to be backdated, claims of a biased investigation contradicted by the actual investigator, conspiracy theories about institutional protection, and no actual evidence that any of his claims were true. I said they could believe whichever version of events made sense to them, but that I'd spent 40 years building a reputation based on careful, documented, reproducible research, that my work had been verified by hundreds of other scientists around the world, that the treatment I'd developed was saving real lives every single day. I said David Chen could tell whatever stories he wanted, but he couldn't change the fundamental reality that my research was real, was documented, was successful, and was built on decades of honest work. The presentation ended. There was a moment of silence. Then the entire room started applauding. Not polite conference applause. Real, sustained applause that went on for almost 2 minutes. People stood up. The standing ovation continued. Colleagues I'd known for decades. Young researchers I'd never met. Doctors who'd used my treatment protocols with their patients. All of them affirming their belief in my integrity. When the applause finally ended, the conference moderator opened things up for questions. Dozens of hands went up. The first person asked where David Chen was now, asked if he was still at the conference, asked if he'd respond to this evidence. I said I didn't know where he was, that he'd given his presentation that morning, and I hadn't seen him since, that he was welcome to present his own evidence if he had any. But he didn't appear, didn't try to rebut anything I'd presented, just disappeared. Another person asked why David had waited 28 years to make these accusations. Why now? I said I could only speculate, that maybe he'd always been bitter about being fired, that maybe he'd convinced himself over the years that his version of events was true, that maybe he'd seen my continued success and couldn't accept that it was based on legitimate work, that maybe he'd thought enough time had passed that the evidence would be forgotten or unavailable. But I said the evidence wasn't forgotten, that Dr. Martinez had kept meticulous records, that the truth was documented and preserved, that lies didn't become truth just because you repeated them for long enough. Someone else asked what would happen to David now, whether there would be consequences for making false accusations at a scientific conference. I said that was up to the conference organizers and the scientific community, that I wasn't interested in revenge or punishment, that I just wanted the truth to be known, that my reputation was built on 40 years of verifiable work, and David's lies couldn't change that reality. The Q&A continued for another 30 minutes. Question after question. People wanting to understand how scientific misconduct investigations worked, how forensic analysis could prove backdating, how someone could falsify data and think they'd get away with it, how the research community protected integrity. I answered every question as honestly and thoroughly as I could, explained that science was built on trust and verification, that we had systems to catch fraud, that those systems weren't perfect but they worked most of the time, that David had been caught because people like Dr. Martinez took integrity seriously. Finally, the session ended. People came up to the stage, wanted to shake my hand, wanted to thank me for addressing the accusations directly, wanted to tell me they'd never doubted me. Some admitted they'd been uncertain after David's presentation that morning, but now understood what had really happened. Dr. Martinez came over and hugged me, told me he was glad he'd kept all those files, that he'd known David might someday try to rewrite history. That documentation was the only protection against lies. Jennifer Wu said she was proud to have worked with me, that she'd learned from me that integrity mattered more than results, that cutting corners might seem faster, but honest work lasted. Barbara hugged me and cried, said she was so glad she could help defend me the way I'd saved her, that seeing all those doctors and scientists applaud felt like vindication for both of us. The rest of the conference was completely different after that. People treated me with even more respect than before, came up to me between sessions, told me they admired how I'd handled David's accusations, that presenting evidence instead of just denying the claims had been powerful. Several conference organizers apologized to me, said they never should have given David a platform, that they'd failed to properly vet his background, that they'd been naive to think his presentation would be abstract and theoretical rather than a direct attack, that they'd make sure this never happened again. I told them I understood, that David had been convincing, that his narrative tapped into real concerns about institutional power and fairness, that it was easy to be deceived by someone who presented themselves as a whistleblower rather than a fraud. David never returned to the conference after my presentation. Someone said they'd seen him in the hotel lobby that afternoon looking shaken, that he'd checked out early and left, that he hadn't stayed for any of the remaining sessions. His blog went silent after the conference. He didn't post anything about my rebuttal, didn't try to defend himself against the evidence I'd presented, just disappeared back into whatever life he'd been living before he decided to launch this attack on my reputation. I flew home the next day, feeling exhausted, but vindicated, feeling like I'd successfully defended not just my own reputation, but the integrity of the scientific process itself, that I'd shown that truth backed by evidence was stronger than lies, backed by nothing but grievance and conspiracy theories. Yesterday was the dedication ceremony for the Crawford Cancer Research Center, the new facility I'd mentioned earlier, named in my honor because of my contributions to cancer research over 4 decades. 200 people attended, colleagues, former patients, medical students, donors, all there to celebrate the opening of a state-of-the-art research facility that would continue the work I'd started. During my speech, I talked about the importance of integrity in science, about how research was built on trust, about how we had to be willing to admit mistakes, to verify claims, to hold ourselves and each other accountable, about how the pursuit of knowledge required honesty above all else. I didn't mention David Chen by name, but everyone there knew what I was talking about, knew I was speaking from recent experience, knew I was reaffirming the principles that had guided my entire career. After the ceremony, a young medical student came up to me. She said she'd been at the conference, had watched the whole thing unfold, had been disturbed by David's presentation that morning, but then convinced by my evidence that afternoon. She asked me how I'd managed to stay calm during David's attack, how I hadn't let anger or fear drive my response, how I'd presented evidence so methodically instead of just defending myself emotionally. I told her something my father had taught me when I was young, that when someone attacks your integrity, getting angry proves nothing, that the only real defense is evidence, that truth backed by documentation will always defeat lies backed by nothing. I said David had counted on me responding emotionally, had wanted me to seem defensive and guilty, but by staying calm and presenting the facts, I'd let the evidence speak for itself. That's what science is, letting evidence speak instead of just arguing about beliefs. The student thanked me, said that was the most valuable lesson she'd learned all year, that she'd remember it throughout her career. 2 weeks after the ceremony, I got a call from a journalist at Science magazine. They were doing a story about scientific misconduct allegations and how researchers should respond to false claims. They'd heard about what happened at the conference and wanted to interview me. I agreed. During the interview, I explained the importance of keeping detailed records, of having colleagues who witnessed your work, of following proper protocols so that your research could be independently verified, of building a reputation based on consistent, reproducible results over many years. The journalist asked if I was angry at David Chen, if I felt he should face consequences for making false accusations. I said I wasn't angry anymore, that I felt sad for him more than anything, that he'd thrown away a promising career through dishonesty 28 years ago, that instead of accepting responsibility and moving on with his life, he'd spent decades nursing a grievance and building an alternate reality where he was the victim. I said that was a terrible way to live, that holding on to resentment for that long must have poisoned his entire life, that he'd wasted years that could have been spent doing something productive, something meaningful, something honest. The journalist asked what I'd say to David if I could talk to him now. I thought about it for a long moment. Then I said I'd tell him it wasn't too late to tell the truth, that he was 70 years old, that he'd spent enough of his life lying, that admitting what he'd done and taking real responsibility might finally give him some peace. But I said I doubted he'd do that people who've been lying for decades often can't stop, that they've invested so much in their false narrative that admitting the truth would mean acknowledging they'd wasted their entire life on a lie. That's too painful for most people to face. The article was published last week. It included interviews with me, Dr. Martinez, Jennifer Wu, and several other scientists who dealt with false allegations. It talked about the importance of research integrity systems and how to respond to misconduct claims, both real and fabricated. The article mentioned David by name, explained his history of data falsification, described his recent attempt to rehabilitate his reputation by making false accusations against me, noted that he'd disappeared after being confronted with evidence at the conference and hadn't responded to requests for comment. I doubt David will try this again. His credibility is completely gone now, not just among scientists who already knew his history, but among the broader public who might have been sympathetic to his story. The evidence against him is too strong, too well documented, too public. But I know there are others like David out there, people who made mistakes or got caught doing something wrong, and now spend their lives trying to rewrite history, trying to cast themselves as victims instead of accepting responsibility for their choices. Science has to be ready for that, has to maintain good records, has to investigate allegations thoroughly, has to be willing to confront lies with evidence, has to protect integrity while also being fair to people who are genuinely wronged. It's not a perfect system. Sometimes real misconduct goes undetected. Sometimes innocent people are wrongly accused. But it's better than the alternative. Better than a world where anyone can make any claim without evidence and be believed simply because they tell a compelling story. Last week, I received something unexpected in the mail. A letter from David Chen. No return address. Postmarked from somewhere in Nevada. The letter was short. Just a few paragraphs. David wrote that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd convinced himself his story was true because he'd told it so many times, that facing all that evidence at the conference had forced him to confront reality, that he'd been wrong, that I'd done the research honestly and he'd tried to steal it, that he was sorry. He wrote that he'd wasted his life on bitterness and lies, that he was 70 years old with nothing to show for it, that watching me receive honors and recognition for legitimate work had eaten him alive because he knew he could have had a real career if he'd just been honest, that his entire life had been shaped by the choice he made at age 35 to falsify data instead of doing the hard work. The letter ended with him saying he didn't expect forgiveness, that he just wanted me to know he finally understood what he'd done, that he was going to take down his blog and his book, that he wouldn't spread lies about me anymore, that he was sorry for trying to destroy my reputation because he'd destroyed his own. I read that letter 3 times, felt a complicated mix of emotions, anger at what he'd put me through, pity for how he'd wasted his life, relief that he'd finally admitted the truth, sadness that it had taken him 70 years to get there. I didn't respond to the letter. There was nothing to say. David Chen had made his choices, had lived with the consequences, had finally admitted what everyone already knew. That was his journey, not mine. I put the letter in a file with all the other documentation from this incident. The evidence, the testimony, the forensic reports, everything preserved and organized, because that's what scientists do. We document, we preserve records, we maintain evidence, not because we're paranoid or vengeful, but because we know that truth needs to be defended with facts. I'm 68 years old now. I've spent 40 years in cancer research. I've published over 200 papers. I've trained dozens of graduate students and postdocs who've gone on to their own successful careers. I've developed treatments that have saved thousands of lives and will continue saving lives long after I'm gone. None of that can be erased by lies. None of that can be stolen by someone making false claims. The work exists. The patients exist. The documented evidence exists. The truth exists independent of anyone's narrative about it. David Chen spent 28 years trying to rewrite history, trying to convince people that my achievements were really his, trying to cast himself as a victim of institutional injustice instead of a fraud who got caught. He failed. Not because I fought him, though I did present evidence when I had to. He failed because lies can't stand up to documented truth, because scientific integrity systems work when people care enough to preserve evidence, because real accomplishments can't be undone by false accusations. That's what I want young scientists to understand. That integrity isn't just about being honest in your own work, though that's essential. It's also about being willing to defend the truth when others attack it, about keeping good records so you can prove what you did, about building a reputation based on consistent, verifiable work that others can build upon. It's about understanding that science is a collective enterprise built on trust, but protected by verification, that we trust each other's results, but we also check them, that we collaborate openly, but we also document carefully, that we give credit generously, But we also protect credit when it's deserved. David Chen violated all of that. Falsified data, tried to steal credit, made false accusations when he was caught, spent decades undermining trust in scientific institutions because he couldn't accept responsibility for his own failures. But the system worked. He was caught. He was stopped. The truth was documented and preserved. And when he tried to revive his lies decades later, the evidence was still there to prove him wrong. That's what gives me hope for science. Not that bad actors never exist. They do. But that we have ways of catching them, ways of preserving truth, ways of defending integrity even when it's under attack. My career is nearly over. I'm considering retirement in the next year or two, but the work will continue. The research center bearing my name will train new scientists. The treatments I helped develop will keep saving lives. The standards I tried to uphold will guide the next generation. And somewhere, hopefully, David Chen is finding some peace. Not by continuing to lie, but by finally accepting reality. By admitting what he did. By stopping his campaign to destroy what he couldn't build himself. That's not my legacy to manage. That's his burden to carry. My legacy is in the lab notebooks, in the published papers, in the patients who survived, in the students I trained, in the documented, verifiable, reproducible work that will outlast both of us. That's what science is, not individual glory or personal recognition, but collective progress toward truth. One carefully documented experiment at a time. One honestly reported result at a time. One life saved at a time. That's what I dedicated my career to. That's what David tried to steal and couldn't. That's what no amount of lies can ever take away. My name is Dr. Helen Crawford. I'm 68 years old, and I'm living proof that integrity, backed by evidence, will always defeat dishonesty, no matter how long the lies persist. The truth has a way of surviving. You just have to be patient enough to let it. Did you like my story? Which country are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next story with love and respect.